Salutations, gentle viewers. This is George from Ireland, and here I am in front of Morpeth Mansions in London. And this is where Winston Churchill resided from 1930 into 1939. The locust years, as he called them. Who was Churchill? Well, Winston Leonard Spencer-Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874 at Blenheim Palace, which is 10 miles north of Oxford. It was his grandfather, the Duke of Marlborough, who owned Blenheim Palace. That title, Duke of Marlborough, passed to Churchill's uncle, then to his cousin, and so on. So although Churchill was descended from the Dukes of Marlborough, he was not in line to inherit the title. His family, they'd been Wiltshire gentry in the 17th century. Sir John Churchill had been on the Royalist side in the English Civil War, and anyway, latterly he supported the overthrow of James II. He was a very distinguished general in the Wars of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, and that's when they were ennobled with this title Duke of Marlborough, because of his resounding victory over the French at Blindheim in Germany, but Blenheim we call it in English. So Marlborough was where they had most of their estates. Anyway, so Churchill, well, have to fast forward through his life, went to St George's School, Ascot, was then a boys' school, so now it was a girls' school, to Harrow School, where he was a complete dunce because he was useless at Latin and Greek, and classics were the mainstay of education back then. He went to Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy. Brainy boys, if they're going to join the army, would be in the engineers or artillery, because they had to calculate the trajectory for shells or building things, do the maths. Fairly smart boys who joined the infantry, but the dimmest of the dim joined the cavalry. Churchill joined the cavalry. So he was thought to be no great shakes at school, although he memorised the whole of Thomas Babington Macaulay's The Lays of Ancient Rome. That's a series of poems. Lays means songs in Old English. And he was a public school fencing champion. Anyway, in the army he distinguished himself at the Battle of Omdurman and so on, and he was a war correspondent in Cuba when there was a nationalist rebellion against the Spanish, likewise in the South African War. He was in India with the Malakand Field Force. Can't tell you his whole life. So let's go to the 30s. So by this stage he was a Conservative Member of Parliament, but he was mistrusted by many of the other MPs, thought that he was not committed, he was really in this for himself. He was an egomaniac. In his own famous phrase, he'd ratted, then re-ratted, been a Conservative, then a Liberal, and then been a constitutionalist, formed his own party. That didn't get him very far, but by this stage he was a Conservative again, representing Wanstead and Woodford, which is northeast London. He'd sat for various other constituencies, such as Manchester North West and indeed Dundee. So in the 30s, the Great Depression was upon the United Kingdom, and he would have no truck with socialism. Conservatives and Labour were the two major parties. The Liberals had been relegated to third-party status. But there was some chance they might come back under Sir John Simon. So appeasement. Well, in 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and he had always vowed to annul the Treaty of Versailles. The French and British were beginning to feel guilty about the Paris peace treaties, thought that they were unduly harsh, unworkable, were minded to give the former Central Powers some leeway in the hope that this would generate some goodwill, but that turned out to be a rash policy. Churchill was a day one abominator of Nazism. He was in Germany once, and Hitler suggested meeting, and Churchill agreed to do so. In the end, the meeting never took place in the early 30s. And Churchill even wrote a book about great men in 1935, in which he listed Hitler and mentioned the man's qualities. Not to say that he was moral, but he said had low cunning and was an evil genius. So Churchill's jeremiads about Germany fell on deaf ears. These were not well received. So soon after the First World War, people had very little wish to fight again, and the British military budget had been cut to the bone. So it was not just cutting fat, it was cutting muscle, and people were desperate to avoid war. The League of Nations Union held a vote in this country. That was an organisation supporting the League of Nations, wrote to everyone, send back this letter, do you vote to never ever fight again or not? And a high majority of people voted that they would never, under any circumstances whatsoever, fight again. There was the Oxford Union resolution, this House would under no circumstances fight for king and country. That was carried. Churchill's son Randolph opposed it. But Churchill was not taken seriously. He was just having a big sulk in the 30s, and they thought he was a grumpy old man. And because of his curmudgeonly attitude, people were not willing to lend an ear to his prognostications about the Third Reich. For instance, on other issues, he was proved himself to be very immoderate, inflexible, backward-looking. India was taking steps towards self-government, and Churchill set his face against these, and people said, well, that just shows you how reactionary he is. He's living in the past. It's completely unworkable. Moreover, the idea that we can defeat the Third Reich is just mindless optimism. He had a Foreign Office official who was secretly feeding him information about this. Nancy Astor and other conservatives denounced Churchill for being a senseless warmonger. The Third Reich put out a poster of him carrying a machine gun saying, "Wanted for incitement to murder." However, by 1938, people were taking a bit more seriously and seeing that the Chancellor of Germany was not to be trusted. His promises of non-aggression always turned out to be promises of aggression. Up until Anschluss, he had been uniting Germans, or even the Sudetenland. But then in March 1939, he was clearly not doing that. He was annexing a territory with very few ethnic Germans, simply taking over Poland. And Churchill was also rabidly anti-communist, saying the Soviet Union ought to be strangled at birth, which obviously put communists against him. Socialists disliked him, having sent troops into Tony Pandy before the First World War. They remembered the general strike of 1926, in which had been against the trades unions. So the only other mighty power in Europe which could assist the British Empire was the Soviet Union, and Churchill made no secret of his utter detestation of communism. Anyway, we all know that on the 3rd of September, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. I shan't go too much into the Second World War, but Neville Chamberlain, who'd been an appeaser up to and including October 1938, appointed Churchill First Lord of the Admiralty. That was the cabinet minister in charge of the Royal Navy. This was the position that Churchill had held at the outset of the First World War. And a message was sent to all ships of the Royal Navy saying, "Winston is back." He then took up his post at the Admiralty building on Whitehall. It's called Old Admiralty now. The Royal Navy does not have a headquarters there anymore. So that's where Churchill lived when he was somewhat in political exile. Still an MP, but a backbencher, and treated with contempt by mainstream opinion. But by 1939, most people thought he'd been dead right all along, and his fantastic oratorical talents could be put to use. I think it was Kennedy said that he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. There are other locations he lived around in London, but this is where he was in the 1930s.